On a cold, wet morning in October 1415, a small, exhausted English army stood facing what seemed like certain death. They were sick, hungry, and surrounded deep inside enemy territory. In front of them stood one of the most powerful armies in Europe, thousands of heavily armored French knights, confident that victory would be easy. What happened next would become one of the most shocking military upsets in history. Against impossible odds, around 6,000 English soldiers would defeat a force nearly 4 times their size. And they would do it with mud, discipline, and one of the most feared weapons of the Middle Ages, the longbow. This is the story of the Battle of Agincourt. The year was 1415, during the long and brutal conflict known as the 100 Years' War between England and France. The young King Henry V of England had recently taken the throne. He was ambitious, determined, and convinced that he had a rightful claim to the crown of France. To prove his strength and secure his legacy, he launched an invasion across the English Channel. At first, things went according to plan. Henry laid siege to the French town of Harfleur. The siege lasted weeks. The city eventually fell, but the victory came at a terrible cost. Disease spread rapidly through the English camp. Dysentery, hunger, and exhaustion weakened the army. Thousands of soldiers died. Many others were too sick to continue fighting. Henry knew he could not stay in hostile territory much longer. He decided to march his remaining forces north toward the English-controlled port of Calais. It was meant to be a simple, strategic retreat, but the French were watching and they were gathering. As Henry's weakened army marched through northern France, French nobles began assembling one of the largest forces seen in years. Knights, men-at-arms, and cavalry answered the call. For them, this was a chance to crush the English king and end his invasion once and for all. By the time the two armies finally met near the small village of Agincourt, the difference in size was staggering. Henry had around 6,000 men left, and most of them were longbowmen. The French army may have numbered between 20,000 and 25,000 soldiers, including thousands of heavily armored knights, the elite warriors of medieval Europe. The French were confident. Why wouldn't they be? They outnumbered the English. They were better armored. Many were experienced fighters from noble families. To them, this battle looked less like a challenge and more like a guaranteed victory. But the battlefield itself would tell a different story. Heavy rain had fallen the night before. The freshly plowed farmland between the two armies had turned into a thick, sticky sea of mud. The field was narrow with dense forests on both sides. This meant the French could not fully surround the English or use their numbers effectively. Henry V understood immediately that this ground could be his greatest advantage. He positioned his men carefully. The longbowmen were placed on the flanks. Each archer carried a sharpened wooden stake, which they drove into the ground at an angle in front of them. These stakes were designed to stop cavalry charges and protect the archers from being overrun. Behind them stood the English men-at-arms, ready to defend the center. Then the waiting began. The French army, confident and proud, delayed their attack. They believed the English were weak and desperate. Some French nobles even argued over who would get the honor of capturing King Henry. Hours passed as both sides stood in the cold, staring across the muddy field. Finally, Henry made the first move. He ordered his army to advance slightly, bringing the longbowmen within range. Then at his command, thousands of archers raised their bows. The sky darkened. Arrows flew forward in massive waves, falling down onto the French lines like deadly rain. The longbow was a terrifying weapon. A trained archer could fire 10 or more arrows per minute. Each arrow could travel hundreds of meters and had the power to pierce armor at close range. The French had no choice but to respond. They launched a cavalry charge, hoping to scatter the archers and break the English line. But the narrow, muddy field worked against them. Horses struggled to move quickly through the thick ground. As they advanced, arrows struck them from every direction. Wounded horses panicked, some fell. Others threw their riders. The charge lost its momentum before it even reached the English line. Then came the main French advance. Thousands of armored knights and soldiers began marching forward across the mud. But their heavy armor, which normally protected them, now became a terrible burden. With every step, they sank deeper into the wet earth. Moving was slow and exhausting. Some slipped and fell. Others struggled just to stay upright. All the while, the arrows continued to fall. By the time the French reached the English front line, many were already exhausted. They were packed tightly together, unable to swing their weapons properly. The soldiers in the back kept pushing forward, pressing the front ranks deeper into the mud. Men began to fall. and when they fell, they often couldn't get back up. Some were trampled, others were crushed under the weight of their own allies. In the chaos, the battlefield turned into a nightmare. The armor that once made the knights nearly invincible now trapped them on the ground. Seeing the French struggling, the English longbowmen did something unexpected. Many dropped their bows, grabbed axes, hammers, and knives, and rushed into the fight. They attacked the trapped and exhausted knights at close range. What followed was brutal and chaotic. Knights worth fortunes in ransom lay helpless in the mud. The narrow field prevented the French from using their numbers effectively. More and more soldiers piled into the same space, unable to retreat or move freely. It became less of a battle and more of a crushing collapse. Within hours, thousands of French soldiers were dead. Many of them were nobles, some of the most important men in France. The English losses, by comparison, were incredibly small. At one point, Henry feared that a new French force might attack from behind. With his men exhausted and heavily outnumbered, he made a harsh and controversial decision. He ordered many of the captured French prisoners to be executed, fearing they might rejoin the fight if the battle turned again. It was a brutal act, but it showed just how desperate the situation still was. By the end of the day, the field of Agincourt was covered in fallen knights and broken armor. The French army had suffered a devastating defeat. Thousands were dead. Many of France's most powerful noble families had lost their leaders in a single day. Against all odds, Henry V and his small, exhausted army had won. The victory sent shockwaves across Europe. How could so many heavily armored knights lose to a smaller, weaker force? The answer was simple: discipline, strategy, terrain, and the power of the longbow. Agincourt changed the way people thought about war. For centuries, armored knights had dominated the battlefield. They were symbols of power, honor, and strength. But at Agincourt, they were defeated by common soldiers with simple wooden bows. The battle proved that numbers alone were not enough. Pride was not enough. Even the strongest armor could not save a man stuck in deep mud under a storm of arrows. King Henry V returned to England as a hero. His legend grew, and the story of Agincourt became one of the most famous victories in English history. Years later, the battle would be remembered in stories, poems, and plays as the day a small band of soldiers stood together and defeated a mighty army. It was a moment where courage, strategy, and circumstance came together to create one of the greatest underdog victories of all time. On that muddy field in 1415, the age of the knight began to fade, and the power of the common soldier changed history forever.